Okay, so I'm going to kick off very soon when I move across to the lectern, and I'm going to do an overview of the project, and then Ruth is going to follow me. I'm going to talk about some of the language and some of the kind of the negotiations, the problems, the complexities around language that we faced during the research as a project team. Carla is then going to be up. Francis is then going to be up. We've changed our mind at the very last minute. Francis is going to then be up talking about social media, talking about some of the representations of transmasculine people who've become pregnant and had babies over the last few years that have informed our research. Then Carla is going to be up talking about conception, followed by Damien, finally, who's going to look at issues around pregnancy loss. So the latter kind of part of this opening session will look at some of the early findings of the project, but I'm going to kick off with an overview of the project, looking at its aims, its questions, and again some of the early findings. Okay, so in 2008, Thomas Beattie, who we're absolutely delighted is here in the audience today. Thomas Beattie's pregnancy created a media storm across the globe. When he was 6 months pregnant, Beattie gave an interview to the US magazine Advocate, which was picked up by international news and screen media. Articles such as "Pregnant Man Feels Swell" in the New York Times were accompanied by a photograph of Beattie showing his pregnant stomach. From newsstands to the Oprah show, the pregnant man story ran on, soon to go viral. As Paisley Correa recollects, the news was met with disbelief, curiosity, revulsion, annoyance, indifference, and much less often, celebration. Some felt that she was still a woman. Others thought that transitioning should mean that Beattie forfeited his right to give birth. Still others, usually women, expressed annoyance at the attention the first pregnant man was getting. A small proportion seemed to have no problem getting their heads around the idea. The cultural resonance of Beattie's pregnancy was not only confined to the US. In 2010, the UK sculptor Mark Quinn, for example, unveiled his 10-foot marble statue of Beattie pregnant, saying that he defined something very important about our time. Though the Guinness Book of World Records in 2010 listed Thomas Beattie as the world's first man to give birth, this was not the first case of trans male pregnancy and birth. For example, in 2000, Patrick Califia wrote about his partner Matt Rice giving birth following sperm donation from friends, and members of trans communities have long reported much earlier incidents of pregnancy and birth following informal sperm donation. The significance of Thomas's story, however, is that it brought trans male pregnancy and birth to wider social and cultural attention. This matters not only in terms of social and cultural understandings of contemporary practices of gender, sexual and intimate diversity, but is important in terms of normalising effects, making possible what might be unthought of for others. Our project then has sought to speak to these shifts, representing the first study to address the sociological implications of trans male reproduction across social, cultural, health, technological, legal and policy spheres in a number of different countries, including particularly countries across Europe, including the UK, Australia and the US. So to kind of give an overview then of the aims of the project, what we wanted to do was to gain an in-depth sociological understanding of the practices, experiences and healthcare needs of the growing number of transmasculine people who may seek to or become pregnant after transition. One question that we've been asked a lot, and often quite kind of sarcastically and with a kind of an agenda, especially in relation to us gaining quite a lot of research funding, is, but how common is this? you know, surely this is a tiny population. How come, you know, so much money has been given to fund what is seen to be a very kind of niche area? Okay, it's very, very hard to answer, of course, this question. It's hard to know how people live their sexual, intimate, gendered lives, but we have got some statistics there. So, for example, 41 trans men participated in a web survey in 2014. 205 men were recorded as giving birth in Australia between July 2013 and June 2018. And then an international support group for trans parents has 4,300 members. And at least 7 documentaries have been released in the last 2 years alone. And as Francis will talk about in their slot, social media and kind of more mainstream media attention on trans pregnancy is kind of gaining lots of cultural attention, gaining more kind of cultural traction all the time. Okay, so I just want to say a little bit about the sort of literature that we're contributing to kind of give an idea of the theoretical slant of the project. So we seek then to contribute to a wide range of interdisciplinary literatures. The project links directly first, of course, to the key concerns of gender studies. So pregnant men have figured large in feminist imaginations, and reproduction has been central to feminist political thinking and activism, which since the 1960s has addressed childbearing and rearing as a root of women's economic disadvantage, a source of their marginalisation in the public sphere, and a cause of frustration, loneliness, and even mental illness. The costs are often seen to be high, emotionally, physical, and financially. Both feminist novelists and non-fiction writers have thus envisaged a future in which men are able to reproduce. Later, post-structuralist feminist scholars would conceive of a post-gendered world where reproduction was untied from female bodies and identities. More recently, feminist posthumanism has reconfigured reproduction outside of gender and indeed outside of human, non-human binaries. So our project then has sought to add to these reconceptualizations of gender identity and gendered embodiment. The project also seeks to bring a new empirical focus to the ever-growing area of trans studies. As the focus of this area is broadened out from textual to empirical studies, there has emerged a literature that explores parenting roles during and following transition. This project then has sought to bring new knowledge and new empirical data to this body of work. The project's focus relates explicitly to sociologies of family, personal and intimate life. Such studies are important to this project through their reflections on socio-demographic changes, which are largely welcomed within this literature as processes of egalitarian progression. Issues of gendered parenting more broadly are foregrounded in sociological literature on practices of intimate diversity. Sociologists have celebrated same-sex relationships often as bringing increased levels of equality at everyday levels. So we hope that our findings and its empirical material will inform future sociological understandings of contemporary socio-demographic shifts around intimacy and personal life more broadly. A more cautious note, though, comes from work on sexual and gendered citizenship studies, which fits closely also with the project's remit. Here, diversity is read as a neoliberalist signifier, a consumable option rather than a material force born out of a politics of social justice. Such debates run through our lines of inquiry, particularly around access to reproductive technologies, and here classed and racialised dimensions are significant. Healthcare is another field that over the last decade has turned its attention to gender and sexual diversity and is key to this project. Recommendations for improved healthcare provision and standards of care for trans people are pivotal to this project's objectives, and we aim to evaluate then the extent to which trans-masculine people who become pregnant and give birth feel supported by health professionals and recognised in care standards in their particular countries. And then finally, in relation to the literature, this project speaks to concerns within feminist science and technology studies, or STS studies. This area often intersects with the concerns of critical health studies, particularly around the stress it places on the need for patient autonomy, professional ethical responsibility, inclusive technology, and responsible technological innovation, areas that this project then will foreground as it moves forward into its dissemination stages. Okay, there are current legal debates which are absolutely pivotal to this project, and which have kind of happened, ironically happened as we've gone through the project. There's been two big legal cases that have occurred that the project is related to and also fed into in terms of recommendations for changes in law. This is a case in the UK in 2019, which is under appeal, and also a German case. So these two legal cases around whether or not a trans-masculine person who gives birth can be named on the birth certificate as parent or father and not as mother are absolutely kind of central to the work that we've been doing and will continue to do. And these two particular cases in the UK and Germany suggest that these issues are likely to arise in lots of other geographical contexts in the following years. So our research questions then, were to look at how trans-masculine people negotiated conception, pregnancy and birth with masculinity. We wanted also to look at how trans-masculine practices of pregnancy and birth were understood in terms of the diversity of intimate life. A key concern was also to look at law and social policy, particularly in relation to those legislative moves that I've just mentioned, in relation to how trans men who became pregnant and gave birth feel supported, feel recognised, and have citizenship rights. In relation to healthcare, one of our research questions was about standards of care, and it was about how the needs of trans-masculine people are respected, are protected, how well cared for our participants felt. And finally, our work very much wanted to look at advances in reproductive technologies and look at how much, to what effect the advances in reproductive technology have impacted on participants' desires or wishes or access to pregnancy. Particularly here is the importance of race and class in terms of access to those technologies. So if you think back to the literature that I've just sketched out, hopefully you can see that these questions kind of map quite closely onto our 5 kind of key areas of literature and our contribution there. So in terms of our participant groups then, we had 3 actual participant groups, one which is missing from this slide, okay, which I need to add on. But firstly, we carried out focus groups with young trans-masculine people in their early stages of transition. So we asked young trans guys and non-binary people whether or not they wished to conceive, whether they thought this was something that they might want to do in the future, whether they thought this was a possibility. And then we carried out 50 interviews with trans-masculine people who had conceived and given birth after transition. So what we wanted to do then was to have 2 kind of life courses, 2 stages, which looked at future projections and desires and possibility, and also looked at kind of present situations and experiences and the past. The one that's kind of missing off that slide is the health professionals. Sorry if there are health professionals here. We also carried out focus groups with health professionals. So we did focus groups with midwives, with doctors, with endocrinologists, and we asked them how much they knew about transmasculine pregnancy and birth, whether or not they'd encountered this. Is this something that their clients, their patients are kind of coming to them for advice? You know, what do they know and what do they not know? And we're kind of thinking about recommendations that we can put forward to enable better education and better practice. So in terms of actually doing our data collection, in terms of going out there and collecting our data then, first of all we started with policy analysis, and if you do want to read our policy analysis documents, they're all there on our website. Okay, so we've got policy analysis documents from the UK, from the States and from Australia. There is one also looking at different European countries which will shortly be available up on the website. We use virtual methods, which Francis is going to talk about, to look particularly at kind of internet support and look at representations of transmasculine people who gave birth. We carried out 7 focus groups and 50 one-to-one interviews, as I said, with both young people and people who had become pregnant and given birth. Focus groups were carried out with representatives from a range of healthcare professions. And then finally, we had Jason, Jason and Rebecca, Rachel, sorry. Jason and Rachel made a film which we're going to preview this evening, and that's one of our methods of data collection, which is kind of a short documentary looking at some of our participants' experiences. Okay, so my colleagues are going to talk more about some of the findings in depth, but just initially then, just to kind of finish with some initial findings, what we've found so far, and I think it's really worth noting and keeping in mind throughout this conference, is that although we're coming to the end of kind of a 3-year project, we've still really only started to analyse the data, and we're going to be looking at this for a long time to come, and I think that's what happens with projects such as this, is that you get your research funding, but actually the real kind of work of analysis, of writing up, carries on way after your money has kind of dried up. So we will be kind of publishing much later, we will be carrying on kind of presenting from this project for a long time. So at this time we're only able then to kind of talk about some very initial findings. And what we've found initially is great challenges with language, both for us as a research team and for our participants, in terms of how they're talked about, how they're represented, and how they represent themselves, and that's something that Ruth is going to talk about soon. There was a huge challenge with healthcare bureaucracy, so people were waiting for a very, very long time for appointments. The whole kind of bureaucratic process of healthcare was something which our participants talked about endlessly as a big problem, and something that really needed to be kind of systematically changed. Participants talked really interestingly about feeling sometimes hypervisual or sometimes invisible while they were pregnant. So some participants felt very much that their masculinity was being re-emphasised or emphasised in a different way through pregnancy, whereas other people, in terms of their kind of identity as male or as non-binary, felt that that was made invisible through their pregnancy, and that pregnancy as a female kind of signifier was seen above and beyond anything else. So that's something very important to this project, and something which we're writing up about at the moment. The importance of online support communities. was emphasised, so that there were those kind of support communities, that those internet sites existed, that those chat rooms, etc. were there. It was of massive, massive importance to our participants. There was real mixed feelings about media coverage. Some people felt that it kind of brought transmasculine pregnancy and birth to the cultural arena, and that ideas and attitudes were changed through that. Others felt that, you know, there was so much bad publicity, especially on social media, especially on Twitter, that it was kind of had like an overwhelmingly negative effect. But there were real mixed kind of reactions about kind of cultural and media coverage. We found that there was very little discussion of fertility preservation with healthcare providers. So GPs had no idea, we found from our focus groups with health practitioners, what to say if somebody went to talk to them about this issue. They had absolutely no idea, they'd never even thought about it on lots of occasions. And also participants themselves said that they, when they were trying to talk to their GPs or other healthcare providers, that they were met with a kind of, with lots of well, just lots of ignorance, yeah, lots of kind of blank faces and confusion. So that's something that we very much want to address in our recommendations for healthcare practice in terms of education and guidelines for healthcare practitioners. And then finally, there were lots of challenges around the re-administration of testosterone and around kind of healthcare following pregnancy and birth. And again, this is something very seriously for healthcare practitioners to kind of take up and will be key to our recommendations. So, early findings, what do participants want? Okay, they want better healthcare, they want more understanding, they want more knowledge. And finally, where ultimately we want greater knowledge, we want greater kind of cultural understandings, and to kind of link back to Doctor Who then, we want the project to show that male pregnancy isn't just science fiction, and that trans parents are out there, as our film will show, out there every day, every week, creating new social realities that sociologists especially should take account of. Thank you.
Right, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about some questions about research ethics that we found, and also about some of the kind of challenges with language that Sally referred to. And these are going to be things we're going to be talking about in more detail shortly. So when we're talking about doing research with these populations, there's questions of who are you to be doing research with a group of people, particularly this kind of research where we're talking to people, where it's very human. And we were thinking about, okay, what kind of ethical approaches can we take to ensure that what we're doing is a reasonable thing to do? Is it okay to be talking to people about such intimate aspects of their lives? So here are some principles that, I mean, this is the kind of thing we can talk about in more detail over the next 3 days. But it was really important to us to centre the voices of our participants. And this is something you'll see a little bit on some of the slides we're going to show you, where we show you quotes from people, for example, talking about their experiences as examples of the kind of themes that we've picked up on. In doing this, though, it's quite important to protect participant confidentiality. So this is a discussion we had with everybody that we talked to about their experiences. And we talked about, for example, changing people's names, so we use pseudonyms here, for example, to refer to people. In some cases, for example, if we're writing about someone's experience, we might not share the city they live in. So these are all things that we're running right through the project. And it's also quite important, there's a growing ethical literature around feminist research ethics, but also specifically about research ethics with trans and non-binary people. And the importance of having research which is centred in community and gives something back. The point is, we're not here to be academics just writing for an abstract audience of other academics. One of the reasons we've invited all of you here today is we want to have a mixed audience of people who do research, people who work in healthcare practice, community members, activists, artists. And so that's also why we've invited so many people to speak at this conference. This isn't just about our work. We're starting off by discussing what we're doing, and we're hoping that over the next 3 days you'll have an opportunity to talk to us about our work. We're starting the conversation now rather than ending it, but we also want to invite others to share what they've been doing. And that's why we also think research is about improving people's lives. We've produced the policy reviews, and we're also trying to speak regularly with midwives and people who work in gender identity clinics. We're also trying to speak with activists and share our findings. So we've been going all over the place, speaking to different people, responding to invitations and trying to share our work. And we're going to keep on doing that for years to come. And this feels like a really important thing. If people are sharing intimate experiences and perspectives from their lives, we want to make sure we're doing something useful with that. And often informed by what they say that they want in their interview. We say, what do you want to achieve from this? So this raises a question, say positionality here, of who is doing the research, who are we? And something that we do have, we're a mixed team of trans and cis researchers, and that's something that's quite important. There's also several of us who have given birth. However, we do not have any trans researchers who have given birth. And this is a question that comes up when you're thinking about who does research. It's about how much can you represent groups that you're researching, and you never can completely. So one of the things we've done to address this, for example, is have an advisory board of people from different parts of the world who will occasionally send updates to and say, can you advise us on this? Can you tell us about that? And many of them are here today. Thank you for coming, we really appreciate it. And again, we invite you to speak with us over the next 3 days if you have comments, thoughts, perspectives, ideas. What we've tried to do is have lots of different groups represented on our advisory board. We have midwives, we have gender clinicians, we have researchers, we have trans birth parents, and we have people from different countries and with different experiences. Something we want to say up front and admit is that we are an all-white research team, and we have a mostly but not entirely white advisory board, and this is something we recognise we should have done better on. It's something that's really important thinking about other research going forward. It was something that the whole way along we kept saying we need to address this more, we need to have more voices, and it's something that we're wondering about our sample where the majority of our research participants are white, and then there's questions raised around how far is that to do with class and access to economic resources in society, who finds it easier or harder to have a child depending on their social situation, and how far is that about who we can reach. So that's something we're going to be reflecting on. Something we have tried to do in our research is still think intersectionally about these issues and think, for example, how much might whiteness share our white participants' experiences, and what are the similarities shared between our participants who are black, indigenous, or people of colour and the white participants. Something that crossed over everybody that we mentioned was questions around language and what the language is of the project. And this slide is the original research project title, Pregnant Men. And that, that's something that gets funding. It's something that if someone is trying to give funding to a research team, they might say, oh yes, I've seen the media coverage, that makes sense to me. But one of the very first things when we started was immediately change the title to Trans Pregnancy, an International Exploration of Transmasculine Practices of Reproduction. And the reason for this is non-binary and genderqueer people and other people who are not women who want to conceive or are becoming pregnant, they're not necessarily identifying as men, but it's completely relevant to the work that we're doing. And as we carried on doing our research, we realised that even this probably wasn't enough. We spoke to people who said, well actually I don't really identify as transmasculine, but I'm grey gender. Is your research relevant? To which the answer is surely yes. This is lifted straight from our data, some of the gender identities that were expressed by people we're talking to. And the size of the images does reflect the numbers. So you can see the majority of people we interviewed identified as a man, as non-binary or transmasculine, but we also had genderqueer people, gender fluid, grey gender, butch, and what we were trying to do is, rather than police these categories, say, oh, how do we open that up? This then causes a problem of we still have, which is how do we refer to the people we've interviewed? Currently, something you'll see on some of our slides and in the conference booklet that we're going with is trans/masculine and non-binary. But this is the compromise we've reached for the moment. If you have any ideas, please speak to us at any point. And as we write and speak with people and look through our interview data, we're constantly exploring how do we even talk about this.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the media representations around trans pregnancy, and just, oh no, wrong computer. As a content warning, I am going to show some tabloid headlines and quotations from media articles which are not always, as we know, in the language that we might want them to be, so just to warn you that that is coming up, but there's nothing too dreadful. I mean, I know it is dreadful, but you know. So I've been looking at sort of news-ish coverage of trans pregnancy. So mainstream newspapers mainly, and stories appearing on things like parenting websites, current affairs, and kind of queer type websites. The stuff I've looked at is all written in English, which shapes it in a particular kind of way, and I am looking at media coverage kind of post Thomas Beattie. So I haven't yet looked at trans and non-binary people's own social media or their own blogs, or their, you know, people who've told their own stories in the media. I'm looking at people who've had their stories told. And for the purposes of today's, I haven't included the media coverage of any of the films that we're showing, just because we were also involved in some of that. I'm not sure how to deal with that yet. So what I've been looking for are the kinds of narratives or discourses that are shaping these stories, whether they are common across different kinds of outlets or over time. And I think it's useful to do that in the context of this bigger project, because it tells us something about the wider landscape in which our interview and focus group participants are thinking about or are getting pregnant. So it offers us a kind of point of comparison, as well for looking at how transmasculine and non-binary folks' own narratives contest or complexify or disrupt or not the kinds of narratives that emerge in the media. And again, we've got this complicated situation where we have also interviewed a lot of the people who have, some of the people who might have been the subject of some of these media stories. So, and these are very initial findings, this is very preliminary analysis, it's a simplification, but what have I found so far? So, there are kinds of different types of article and the kind of tropes within them. The first is your most basic kind of article, which is literally just saying, a man is pregnant, and it is invariably a man. So, for example, Hayden Cross in The Sun here. And so these articles tend to appear in tabloid papers. Their dominant narrative is about novelty, it's about spectacle, this is the shock of the new, it's the sort of, how is this even possible type reporting. One of the pieces, the earlier one from 2010, was in a section of the Telegraph called, How About That? It's very that. I'm going to say these articles tend to be a bit older, and what I mean by older is sort of up to around 2017, so like literally 2 years ago. I think they will persist. They also generally commit all the crimes of poor trans representation. They dead name people, they print pictures of people pre-transition, they say people were born female, all of that kind of stuff. They also tend to be very picture heavy. The kind of spectacle, the sight of the pregnant trans body, often naked from the waist up, is a key element of the sort of incredibleness of this narrative. And it's also worth noting that across media outlets. The subjects of these types of stories tend to be white, they tend to be trans male identified, they tend to be coupled, usually with a cis male partner, and they have all, I mean this is partly because they've only looked at things in English, located in the US or the UK. So the kind of peak type of this article is the whatever country's first pregnant man type story. So after Thomas Beattie in the US, other countries including Germany, Finland and Israel followed with their own kind of first pregnant man stories. Here in the UK we've had 3 first pregnant men, one in 2012 and 2 in 2017. And this reporting represents a phenomenon that C.N. Lester has described as the shock of the new, which reflects this kind of wider tendency towards sensationalism and these sort of narrow, predictable narratives in reporting on trans issues. And it's a kind of cultural amnesia. If everything is new around trans issues, it relies on a kind of active production of ignorance. Trans and non-binary people, it's not that they're being ignored, but they are disconnected from any sense of kind of history and made kind of novel and unknowable and kind of, ooh, where did they come from? And so Lester says, this can often obscure and distort the truth in a way that even silence could not. And so, okay, what I found also kind of recurring in these types of articles is the specific relationship that's constructed between pregnancy and what's invariably termed transition, inverted commas. And we see this in talk about people putting transition on hold in order to get pregnant, or of someone having undergone a partial transition as shorthand for saying, oh, well, you know, they're not really transition, they're not really trans, they've still got the parts that allow them to get pregnant. So in most cases, this narrative is saying that there's a kind of deviation from the linear path of transition, and that transition is this thing that definitely has a very clear set endpoint in full transition, and that any diversion from this is kind of a kind of going off track suspension of that bigger kind of progress narrative. So pregnancy is in a way constructed here as antithetical to full transition, which I would argue positions or repositions sort of true transness as something which cannot also include pregnancy. So I'm not saying that this is not how people may experience it, but it's very much, what I'm interested in is why this has become the narrative through which we're understanding this, and why this is the kind of headline narrative that has emerged out of what Ruth has already kind of shown is a much more kind of complex picture. And I think it emerges because it emerges in relation to people who are identified in the articles as trans men, and it is doing some work to keep the category of man and pregnant separate, even as it tells the story of the miraculous kind of pregnant man. And so this is a story, kind of narrative that really only works for trans men, where you cannot talk about non-binary or genderqueer pregnancy in this narrative, so it's also sort of excluding them. Looking at sort of newer articles, at least in the mainstream press, I think we can see the subject of novelty kind of moving on. Perhaps the pregnant man is not as exciting as he used to be. And so there's a sort of, I think we've got a new era where there has to be something a bit more, maybe a non-binary partner, maybe better still a trans feminine partner, as fodder for this kind of trope of novelty. So for example, the Mirror recently declared this family Britain's most modern family, and I love that even the doctor was trans. And it's maintaining the kind of importance of this being a first, and it being something, the constant kind of novelty. So I think there's something interesting here about the shift from the kind of individual to the family unit. We've also got at the moment Jake Graff and Hannah Winterbourne talking about their kind of trans family. Generously, I want to say, are we kind of seeing more types of trans families in the press? But the more kind of realistic part of me thinks that this kind of increasing inclusion of trans women in these narratives offers another avenue for the media to pursue trans misogyny, another way to say that trans women aren't women. In the UK context at the moment, I think the media are looking for that kind of thing. So finally, the other slightly less frequently occurring narrative, but one that I think we unfortunately might see more of, at least in the UK, is where stories not reporting on trans or transmasculine or non-binary pregnancy directly, but on changes to policy or guidelines. So in these articles we get the raising of the kind of spectre of the erasure of women from the sphere of pregnancy or parenting, and so a lot of language that highlights kind of censure or loss. So the BMA's guidelines on in October 2017 about using the term pregnant people rather than expectant women is reframed as, you know, oh, they're trying to ban us from calling people women or mothers, and the coverage around the court case that Sally was talking about how birth parents are recorded on birth certificates was all about, you know, a child without a mother rather than a child with a parent who has been correctly recorded on their birth certificate. So yeah, I think optimistically there have been in the last year some more stories that are tend to be the reports of research, which are focusing more on the kinds of things that we've been encountering in our research about the sorts of barriers and the sorts of healthcare needs of trans masculine and non-binary pregnant people. So, you know, fingers crossed, maybe this is the way that coverage is going to go. I think I just about wedged that into 10 minutes. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Carla Pfeffer from the University of South Carolina. I was primarily in charge of data collection in the United States and in Canada, and today I'm going to talk to you about some preliminary findings from preliminary data on conception specifically. So we know from what you've heard so far today that in general there's reasons to believe that trans pregnancy or transmasculine non-binary conception is something that is on the rise. We know from Francis's presentation that there's lots of sensationalist coverage out there, but there's relatively little focus on actual processes of transmasculine and non-binary conception and the meanings that folks attribute to it. We found in our preliminary data that participants conceived through a number of different methods: intercourse with a partner, sperm donation, undergoing fertilization via various methods, like insemination or in vitro fertilization, either using their own and or partner or donor's gametes. If we take a look at previous literature, Veal and colleagues conducted a quantitative survey of 923 participants. And these were transgender and gender diverse youth. And they found that nearly 1 in 20 of their participants reported some sort of involvement in pregnancy, and that could be either experiencing pregnancy themselves or being involved in impregnating someone else. That's a rate that parallels, in general, the rates of non-trans and gender-diverse youth in the population. And in personal correspondence with the lead author on this particular study, I found that the percentage of people who were assigned female at birth was about 3.7% in their sample of becoming pregnant. Charter and colleagues, in an interview with 16 Australian transgender men, reported that a majority of their participants negotiated the receipt of donor gametes through more informal channels, that would be friends, and using self-insemination, which was frequently described as easy and straightforward. By comparison, participants who accessed sperm through reproductive clinics reported largely negative experiences. James Abra and colleagues, in interviews with 6 trans men living in the US, found that while a minority had positive experiences with reproductive clinics, most found clinics to be largely focused on cis people's fertility needs and cisgenderist. Light and colleagues, in a web survey of English-speaking participants, 41 of them, trans men, found that 31 had conceived using gametes from a partner, 4 from a known donor, and 6 used anonymous donor sperm accessed via a reproductive clinic. So I want to talk a little bit about our study. Oops, I'm going to back up. Here we go. We basically conducted so far interviews with 51 adults who experienced pregnancy as either a trans, masculine, or non-binary person. I'm not going to go through all of this because you've heard about some of it so far. The central question of this research that I'll be talking with you about today is how do trans-masculine and non-binary participants talk about their experiences of becoming pregnant, and how is it that they utilize both normative resistance and inventive pragmatism as they negotiate conception. So if we take a look at the participants, of the 51 participants, 18 are from the US, 14 from the United Kingdom, 9 from Australia, 7 from the European Union, and 3 from Canada. Average age is about 33 years at the time of the interview. Of the participants, 21 self-reported their gender as trans man or trans masculine, 11 as man, 11 as non-binary, and 8 as either genderqueer, androgyne, fluid, or gray gender. And I'm happy to talk to you more about sexualities of participants and ethnicities of participants as we continue along. In general, 46 participants reported their ethnicity as white, Caucasian, Anglo, or European, while 5 reported their ethnicity as Asian, mixed race, Hispanic, or Black. So preliminary analysis. We engaged in professional transcription. We've done fidelity checking by project team and our RAs. The preliminary analysis for this particular bit of data that I'm reporting on today was led by Damien W. We used inductive thematic analysis, and we also found that we reached thematic saturation at 26 participants, but kept on data coding throughout the rest of the interviews, using both open and focused coding. I'm going to talk to you about 7 broad themes. I'll mention the 7 broad themes today, and 9 focused themes that were interpreted through 2 distinct frameworks. So these are the emergent broad themes, and I'm not going to speak to these too much today. Just want you to see what they are. Give you a second here. I'm going to speak a little bit more about the emergent focused themes today. And I'm going to use the frameworks of normative resistance and inventive pragmatism. This is a conceptual frame that I developed in an article that was written for Gender and Society that's really focusing on 21st century family making. So normative resistance is any strategy or action for making life choices that are considered distinct in some way from that which are most socially expected or normalized. Inventive pragmatism, on the other hand, are strategies and actions that might be considered clever manipulations of an existing social structure in order to access some sort of resources. So here, there are 5 themes related to normative resistance and 4 related to inventive pragmatism. So I want to briefly introduce you to this very first focus theme that emerged. So this is kind of a donor matching theme. So here we see, I'm going to give you some time to read through some of these narrative snippets. We see folks who are kind of connecting in some way to donor matching or resisting donor matching. So in her work on lesbian recipients of donor sperm through fertility clinics, we see Mamo arguing that folks have these affinity ties where descriptions of potential donors are used as selling points to create some sort of a sense of relatedness, often through matching characteristics with donors. If you look at these particular snippets, you see some of our participants, like Tom and Finn, resisting the idea of matching donors for specific reasons. Other participants, however, did not resist donor matching. Okay, so they're embracing it. So you see them embracing it in some contexts, and you see them resisting it in others. Sorry, water. We also saw that our participants had much to teach us around resisting this notion that donors should not be considered kin. So if you have familiarity with lesbian families, for example, many folks are sort of resisting this notion that there should be any talk of donors as a family member, right, or as fathers specifically. And we saw some of our participants very much resisting this notion, right? So take a look here, some of these narratives. we've got this great quote. The donor is the kid's spunkle, and in their lives it's extended family. His parents are Grand Spunkle and Grand Sparkle, and know the kids, and the kids know them. And that's actually been a very rich and lovely process. And then we have Paul saying, she, the sperm donor, wanted to be sure that my child knows where my child comes from. And the child has grandparents, right? So here we see both the connection with the donor and the donor's parents with the child. On the other side, we have some inventive pragmatism here. So here we have folks saying, all of my pregnancies resulted from bump and uglies with my husband. We have another participant saying, we started trying the old-fashioned way. So here we have participants using these phrases like bump and uglies, right? And trying the old-fashioned way, very inventively talking about what most would refer to as cisgender heterosexual intercourse, but in the ways that folks were describing how they became pregnant here, this was often an inversion or a challenge to traditionalist cisgender ways of heterosexuality, right? So in some instances it was sex between people who are both transgender, which is something that, again, inverts this dynamic or this assumed cisgenderism of heterosexuality. So I've got a grab bag of themes that I'm not going to have time to talk about, but I want to talk about some preliminary conclusions that we're making here. So based on our findings, what we're seeing is that transmasculine and non-binary conceptions and experiences are simultaneously variable, they're particular, they're often non-extraordinary. So simply by telling their stories, we see that transmasculine and non-binary participants really resist the erasure of their own conception experiences. And they resist the media narrative that all transmasculine and non-binary conception is somehow exotic or the very first time, or the very first type of its kind in the world. And our participants' narratives, as we're finding them, really do broaden 21st century family-making themes. Our participants' experiences also note this need to broaden or bring additional research around how donor matching is addressed and how it happens. What are some next steps? Next steps here. We want to make sure that we've done enough participant transcript checking so that our participants have had a chance to review the transcripts. Engaging in member checking as well, making sure that our themes are on point. We want to conduct axial coding, so making sure that we have a sense of how participants' data might change by groups depending on their race or their social class or their gender identity, for example. We want to publish a lot. References. If you have questions about the references for this project, I'm happy to pass these along to you, just let me know. And I have some information about context here that's kind of hard to read on this slide. But it's pfefferc@mailbox.sc.edu. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Damien Riggs. I'd like to start by just giving, I guess, a content warning. Obviously this fund talk is about pregnancy loss. Maybe people in the room who've experienced pregnancy loss, or his partners have, or loved ones. So just be aware that I'm going to have some, like Carla did, some quotes up here from some of our participants. So some of my own research looks at cis men and women in pregnancy loss. And so I was really interested as we started reading the transcripts, seeing that more and more of our participants had experienced at least one and some multiple pregnancy losses. So in total, almost a third of our participants had experienced at least pregnancy loss. For most people, this was an early term pregnancy loss, so some people had experienced, I think 5 people had experienced a later term pregnancy loss. And 15 of the 16 participants who'd experienced a pregnancy loss had since become pregnant again and given birth, a live birth. So I took the lead in doing a thematic analysis of those 16 participants, so that's who I'm talking about now. We didn't primarily go in to talk about pregnancy loss, but certainly at our team meeting we acknowledged pregnancy loss or abortions could be topics that people could bring up, so we definitely had sort of follow-up or probe questions when we asked people about their pregnancies, if they had experienced that, and if people said yes, we invited them to speak more. If they didn't want to, we did, of course, push that topic, and some of our participants didn't want to talk more, and some of our participants, there are a number of pages of the transcript talking about pregnancy loss. So the themes that we identified were how people accounted for the cause, and I've got this on the next screen. We didn't ask people what caused your pregnancy loss, but people oriented to that topic. What were their psychological responses? For some people, there was this really interesting take on pregnancy loss that had a positive meaning, which I'll talk you through in a minute, what kind of support people got or didn't get, and then fears that came about as a result of having experienced a pregnancy loss. So again, I said here, we asked people what the cause was. We really just said, you know, have you experienced a pregnancy loss? Yes, would you like to talk more about that? That's really all we asked. So some participants, understandably, and mirroring the broader literature on pregnancy loss, had very negative accounts of a pregnancy loss. So one participant said, I was suffering from anorexia and bulimia, and they were twins, so a young body that wasn't healthy, wasn't eating right. So it was that how that participant accounted for a pregnancy loss. Another person had experienced violence from an older child who had thrown them down the stairs, and that had resulted in a pregnancy loss. Probably equal number of participants really normalised pregnancy loss, and that really repeats the literature on pregnancy loss more broadly, that we know up to a third of pregnancies result in a pregnancy loss. So many people said, like, this participant, we understood what happens a lot, so we weren't too worried about it. I didn't put this up here, but there were other participants who really disliked that narrative, and again, that's in the literature on pregnancy loss. People say, it doesn't help me to tell me that lots of people experience it, I'm still grieving. When people were asked, when people then spoke about the specificities of what it was like to experience a pregnancy loss, those were again overwhelmingly negative. So I went completely off the rails, absolutely went nuts. It felt really hard and fucked up. I was pretty devastated, and it was horrible. I was so and again, so while some participants felt they were prepared, they knew the stats on pregnancy loss rates, other participants felt like they really weren't. And part of our questioning is this quite trans and non-binary specific? If people, healthcare professionals, are not really aware of trans and non-binary people's needs around pregnancy, they're not going to be aware of talking about pregnancy loss as a possible outcome. So one participant said, I was so naive in all this, we had just stumbled into it, and I was just really happy, and the last thing I expected in a way, so it was very traumatising. But as I sort of nodded to earlier, some participants framed it as a positive sign. So one participant said it really felt more positive than negative. It was sad, but more like this can happen. It felt like, which I love this sort of analogy, it felt like we had a bite, like in fishing you have a sort of nibble on the line. So it was this idea that we've gotten pregnant, didn't go as planned, but it means hopefully we'll try again, we'll get pregnant again. Another participant said I was just thankful that it worked at all, because it was also like, I didn't know about my fertility, so it was always, even if it could lead to miscarriage, I was like, at least it would mean my egg and his sperm, it works. Again, I think this speaks to sort of trans and non-binary specificities around pregnancy and pregnancy loss, of people not being aware of the effects of testosterone, people being concerned and lacking literature or information from healthcare professionals about what that may or may not mean for a pregnancy. With the availability of support, for some people it was limited because they had sort of kept their pregnancy on the down low because they weren't sure how families going to respond. So if a family doesn't know you're pregnant, it's hard to turn to your family for support. For other people, they had really felt like, and this is a small number of participants that felt like they'd gone to the hospital when they'd experienced a pregnancy loss, they just got no support at all. No one had said, do you need to talk to someone? And one participant I remember noted that, not only did they get asked, do they need someone to speak to, their partner hadn't been offered anyone, which is very common in the literature as well. Other participants, however, did experience support, and some really spoke about hospitals going out of their way. So one said, the nurses are really wonderful. I was told, just so you know, like it's super common, 1 in 4 pregnancies, especially this early on, does not end up being viable. You did nothing wrong, this is not because you're trans. Now again, some participants may not have found that helpful, that idea that this happens to lots of people, so it's normal that it happens to you. But for this participant, it was helpful. Another participant spoke about having friends who had supported them through the whole journey, so it was really important to have them there. And other people really valued other people who had experienced a pregnancy loss, saying, I have an idea of what you're going through, I can empathise. Some participants, and this is the final thing, spoke about fears. So one person was very sort of fearful. I had to go to the emergency room and in effect out myself as trans. This is not something I normally do, and so it's a huge fear, and I sort of was pushed into having to do that because of the miscarriage. And another person was very aware that this would mean that they had sort of carefully managed having a medical record about being trans, and this sort of pushed something into their medical record they didn't otherwise want to have that. So in conclusion, so as I said, I sort of referred to the literature a lot. The literature is on cis women and men. And so there's a lot of similarities. We see similarities around the trauma of a pregnancy loss. We see similarities around how people account for causes of pregnancy loss. And we see the similarities around really differential responses. So some people having great supportive families and friends, and other people having really poor responses from friends and families and from healthcare professionals. And that's particularly in the literature on cis men and pregnancy loss really not being seen as grieving, being really only there to support a female partner. But there was really, as I already mentioned, a couple of different things. There was really quite a number of trans and non-binary specific things that was around concerns about discrimination, it was perceptions of discrimination, including from healthcare professionals and from family. It was about the intersections of loss and the idea that the loss can be indicative that, hey, this is working. So there's two things going on at once. It's not just, oh, we got a bite. It's also, we had a loss. So there's two things happening. And it's about that which Frances and Sally and Ruth and Carla have spoken about, is that situatedness in society more broadly around trans and non-binary pregnancy and wanting to bear a child, and how other people perceive that as a positive thing or something that shouldn't be happening, and then how people respond to a pregnancy loss in the context of that. Thank you very much.